I'm Megan Taplin. I'm the park manager for the Knysna area of the Garden Route National Park, which encompasses the Knysna Estuary and the forests and the fynbos from Gona to Diepwalle and down to Harkeville, for those of you who know the area. I'm going to be talking to you about co-developing narratives and indicators as catalysts for adaptive governance of the Knysna Estuary. And it sounds very complicated and fancy, but I'm talking from a manager's perspective with the help of colleagues, my scientist colleagues, so hopefully there'll be some lessons to learn. Just to give you a little overview of where Knysna is, if you don't know the area, we've got the Knysna Estuary, which, as you can see, might be able to see from that map, is located kind of surrounded by the town of Knysna. So it's a very open access and urban part of the park, and then the forest areas are up above in the mountainous areas and to the east where Harkeville lies. And just showing you up in the top right hand corner, that's all our national parks, just to give you an idea of where our park is, the Garden Route National Park is compared to the rest of the national parks in South Africa. And then the little map on the bottom right-hand corner shows you the different areas of the Knysna Estuary. The water body we manage as the biodiversity area, there's a lot of regulations attached to that. And then there's a little strip around the estuary where we have some control we have to authorize any developments that happen in that area. But then the bigger part of the protected environment is, as you can see, in the urban area and the agricultural area around the park, and there's a lot of rivers and streams draining into the estuary. So a little bit about the Knysna Estuary. It's very uniquely biodiverse. It's rated #1 out of 249 estuaries in South Africa in terms of biodiversity and conservation importance. It's got the largest population of the endangered Knysna seahorse. It's got the largest and most extensive eelgrass beds in the country, so there's a lot to protect. It's also a common pool resource used by many. It's a source of livelihoods and benefits for many different types of stakeholders, from subsistence fisher people to the tourism industry, and then to local business in general. It's very developed. There's a lot of property developed around the estuary, and even in the estuary there's 2 islands in the estuary. Property values are very high if you've got a view of the estuary or if you're nearby the shore. And then it's very impacted as well by all the municipal infrastructure that affects the estuary through the stormwater systems and the sewage systems that drain into the estuary. There's something like 111 outlets into the Knysna Estuary. And there's some very developed areas around Knysna that impact these drainage systems into the estuary. So to just recap, it's a very complex system. It's a key natural asset. And we needed to acknowledge the complexity of the system and the importance that the estuary plays for the economy of Knysna. And that really was heightened during COVID, when there was one of the lockdowns included closing down the water bodies and the beaches, and that affected Knysna very much, and it made a lot of people sit up and complain, first of all, but secondly notice how important the estuary was, not just for tourism but for business in general, because everybody just left Knysna. There was nothing to do without the estuary. And then I think there was a need for us to help stakeholders to understand, or to communicate with stakeholders to understand the complexity of the system, and therefore the complexity of the type of management that's needed, and the need for stakeholders to buy in and be involved in this process. So this was some of the things I hear on a daily basis. As a manager, I'm confronted with many different needs and wants of stakeholders, all competing with each other, or in some cases competing with each other, and also their complaint. Things like, Why can we only take out 50 prawns? We need to have 100 prawns because we can't catch fish with 50 prawns, and I just want to feed my family. SANParks must repair the retaining walls around Leisure Island, which is one of the islands in the estuary, because the estuary is damaging it. What's the carrying capacity for activities on the estuary? Why don't you allow more boats and more commercial activities? Why aren't the rangers picking up litter around the estuary? It's their job. They're not supposed to be sitting around in their khaki uniforms in the office. SANParks must stop the impact of the sewage on the estuary. Why are they doing nothing about it? The mega yacht building industry is growing in Knysna. It's going to become the mega yacht building capital of the world. If SANParks doesn't facilitate launch and commissioning sites, we'll move our business elsewhere and business will suffer. And my personal favorite, I've told SANParks what to do and how to manage the estuary, but they just don't want to listen and do it. So I spoke to some of my colleagues and the scientists about my frustrations, and especially how some stakeholders have very loud voices and complain about very specific issues without understanding the complexity of the system. They don't know how complex the system is, what all goes into management of the system. They don't know what we're doing. They don't know what efforts we're already making. So we came up with some ways to jointly protect the Knysna Estuary, or some ways to engage these stakeholders. And also something I didn't mention in the previous slide was that there was a paper that was written about the Knysna Estuary and how it's the most biodiverse estuary, or it was the most biodiverse estuary, but it's being degraded due to poor management. So we came up with a different way to tackle a response to that paper, and we came up with a project or a strategy of co-developing governance indicators. And then that was as a precursor to a legislative process that we had to follow of developing the estuary management plan, which we are currently involved in. The process that we came up with was to develop a principle-based framework, then to identify the stakeholders, conduct pre-dialogue stakeholder survey, which we did virtually because it was during COVID times, and then to facilitate a stakeholder dialogue. We did that mostly through an online dialogue, but we did make exceptions for certain cases, which I'll explain about. Then we developed the draft indicators, and we circulated that among stakeholders to ask them, did they agree with these indicators? And also how do they think we're already implementing them or not? And then we finalized the indicators, and then we asked them to rate the current performance. So the framework that we used was based on four main principles which were identified, and we sent that out with the descriptions and the criteria and based questions on these criteria to assess the governance of the Knysna Estuary. The first one was about polycentric institutions, where the responsibilities are shared and decision-making is passed to the lowest level possible, whether there's appropriate knowledge and mechanisms to support engagement with this process. Then about collaboration, whether different levels of government and public, private and civil institutions could engage with the process and have a meaningful input, whether there's a shared understanding of the problems and also the goals or the vision, and whether diverse stakeholders work together for a common purpose. Then there was one about social learning, where is there interaction between different types of stakeholders that leads to new understanding and possibly new behavior as well? So is there a sustained program of multi-stakeholder input? And does this input or deliberation and discussion lead to an increase in trust and people understanding each other better and heading towards improved decision making? And then about complexity thinking, understanding that it's a very complex system, socio-ecological system, and that it's unpredictable, and regularly we have to adapt our knowledge and adapt what we know about the system. And then that this deliberation leads to an increase in trust, oh sorry, I'm reading the wrong one, that we form a systems perspective of how the whole system works together. Okay, and then in terms of the stakeholder identification, we used stakeholder lists or forums that we had already to identify stakeholders, but we tested that list of stakeholders by looking at, was there a diversity of stakeholders, those that are impacted and affected, as well as those that have the power to enable or constrain? Was there a diversity of perspectives amongst the stakeholders in terms of gender, age, ethnicity, geographical location, knowledge range as well? So did we include anybody from scientists to the general public? And then did we have a diversity of decision makers and the supporting roles that support these decision makers? So once we ticked all those boxes, we came up with 33 individuals from 21 stakeholder groups. And we invited all of those to participate. Some didn't participate, but we had fairly good participation. And I think the reason for that is that we used a personal approach of the park manager actually sending out letters and engaging with the stakeholders to say, I would really like you to contribute to this process. Really? Oh, goodness, okay. Only 5 minutes, okay. So with the pre-dialogue survey, there was a very good response, which showed that stakeholders were wanting to contribute. For the dialogues, the stakeholder dialogue, we did it virtually, and it all worked very well with people who know about technology and could break away rooms in Microsoft Teams or Zoom or whatever it was, which I don't know how to do. But we made very sure that people understood what we were trying to do, what the purpose of the indicators were, that it's not about management of the estuary, but it's about governance, and improved governance can lead to improved management. And also that we used language that people would understand, even if they weren't a scientist. So for that reason also we had one in-person group where people who said they didn't want to use technology, and also our subsistence fisherwoman group who don't engage with things like that. So we had them in a room and we used the language that they wanted to use, and in that way we made sure that we catered for all types of stakeholders. There were many issues that got brought up which we grouped into different categories. And then some of the issues that they highlighted in the pre-survey was that conflict is common, considering the complexity and the diversity, that there are some mechanisms already in place to resolve conflict, and that decision makers and stakeholders already partly work together to resolve conflict, and that many of them do already participate in some kind of forum. And then there were some visions and dreams that came up for the estuary, and I'm not going to go into detail about them now, but they were just wonderful types of visions and dreams that people had, and it was very inspiring to see that people do feel that way. And many of them are common as well, and many of them looked to the future and wanted their children and grandchildren to be able to appreciate what they appreciate. And then we got input from the stakeholders during the dialogue, and we grouped it into those 4 principles. Again, I don't have time to go through all of these, but you know, things like if we mess up the estuary, everyone loses. There's already a forum that is established that is working well, etc. like that, things like that. In social learning and complexity thinking as well, people made suggestions and identified problems. And then we used all of those stakeholder inputs to develop these 8 indicators, 2 for each principle. So these were kind of the goals, basically, for how we can determine whether the Knysna Estuary is being governed effectively. These governance indicators were then sent to the stakeholders, and they were asked if this does fit into what they've said during the dialogues, if this is going to give them a good idea of how, of how we can evaluate the estuary governance and see whether we're doing a good job or not, or whether we're on the right track. So then we asked stakeholders also to rate the usefulness and the current performance against each indicator, and basically what came out of that is that the ones that they rated poorly, where we obviously need to do some more work, is that decision makers had defined roles, that there's conflict, that there is conflict resolution, and that there's a systems perspective. And then the ones that they rated well, that are going well, is that there's monitoring and research in place that informs management, and that we're doing a good job at integrating the diverse knowledge about the estuary. The ones that they rated average, but which still not bad, were that there's shared understanding and cooperation, there's coordinated, collaborative actions and shared vision, and that there's deliberate and sustained learning. And then stakeholders did say there was a feeling of there's fair agreement on a common vision. That's what came out during the pre-dialogue survey. And it's interesting that when we got to the estuary management plan, where we developed a vision with stakeholders, that there were 3 different groups of very diverse stakeholders that all came up with very similar visions that could quite easily be combined into one. And you know, this mirrors a lot of the things that people said during the adaptive governance developing of principles. So it's great that it has been used to inform that, and that you know, people have a shared vision of the way forward. Okay, I've got to end off now. I've only got 2 more slides. So what's the way forward? It's important that we use this, these principles that we've developed now as a precursor for what we're going through with the estuary management plan. That's our way of being able to translate governance into management. So there is a link between adaptive governance and adaptive management. They can be viewed as 2 subsystems of an integrated learning system. Governance gives us a means of resolving trade-offs and conflicts to establish the public interest, and management in turn gives us the means to turn public interest into action or reality. So on the ground, management learning through adaptive management can influence public interest in the governance cycle. And then just quickly, the way forward, I think what's very, well, let me talk first about the challenges and the opportunities. So through this process that we ran, I think some of the opportunities that were good or positive was that there were strengthened stakeholder relations were formed. We found common ground and visions and enhanced understanding between stakeholders. It's served as a valuable precursor to the estuary management plan process. And then some of the challenges going forward is that the system is very complex and changing by its nature. So things are always going to change and things are always going to need to be adapted. Then the instability of certain authorities, especially the local municipality, can be a real challenge to this whole process of moving forward. We need long-term buy-in and allocation of resources by supporting role players. Otherwise, the whole process won't work. And accountability and responsibility need to be accepted by all. And that's slowly happening, but some sectors more effectively than others. And then something like moving towards adaptive co-management, where we actually, it's not just SANParks managing the estuary because of the complex system, is a very noble aspiration, but it might not work in practice because there might be a multitude of conflicting objectives without one management voice that can lead to inaction and ineffectiveness. So I think what gives me hope is that there are very active civil groups and individuals that are trying to make a difference now and saying we're not going to wait for the municipality to do this or SANParks to do that, we're going to contribute out of our own. And you know, it's important that the authorities are starting to become more effective. Well, we hope they do. And then we can move towards adaptive co-management.